Welcome, Gaynor.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for that introduction.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. So, Gaynor, your research is incredibly relevant to our theme of well-being that we're discussing today. Maybe to start with, could you tell us about your role at UniSA?
Okay, so my role is at UniSA, as you've indicated, so I'm a professor. So a professorial lead, which means that I have the role of supervising and mentoring other staff, and I have a group of PhD and master's students that I supervise as well. But I've also got a research team that works in this area and supports the research that I'm doing, that's looking at health and well-being and how exercise and physical activity impact on well-being.
Brilliant. So how did your interest in exercise psychology begin?
Okay, so it's not a long story. I can cut it short. But I started life as a sports psychologist and working with elite squads. And the two elite squads in the UK that probably had the biggest impact on me was working with ice skaters and working with England hockey, England ladies hockey team. Now, in the UK, as you know, you may know, it gets dark at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, like in the winter, and it's rainy and it's wet. And we identified that that our hockey players were losing matches in the final quarter. And it was more because of the fatigue that was having an impact on the decision making and what they were doing rather than their abilities. And so we had this challenge of actually trying to make them or help them to train when they were at home and living. And so that at home in England would be anything from living in Whyalla to living in Robe and travelling to the city, travelling to Adelaide to train every other weekend or once a month. So you've got young ladies, sort of, they were the 21-year-olds and younger, that were either at school, at university, or had jobs that had to come home after work. It's wet, it's cold, it's rainy, and go out and train. And so that was a big, so I wasn't working on psychological skills, I was working on motivation to exercise and train. And then also one of the other biggies that happened with the skaters was that if they got injured, the impact of injury on their well-being and on their psychological state was really profound. Their identity's lost. They don't know what to do because going to the rink was what they did. So injury had a big impact on their mental health. And so I changed focus when I had a young family and I couldn't travel world championships and the Olympics and things like that, to focus on leaving the elite sports behind, but focusing more on the exercise and that well-being link.
That is so interesting. It really breaks my heart whenever I watch the Olympics and I see people get injured because they've been working towards that.
Oh, absolutely.
Years and years and years.
For our athletes this year, when our athletes had to, the Olympics was taken off the table because of COVID. They've been training for 4 years, and some of them for even longer because they'll have had the 2020 games as their focus. So yes, it's a big thing for them.
It's huge, and it's great looking at the psychological effects as well as the physical ones.
Yeah.
So, What are you focusing on at the moment?
Okay, so a couple of major focuses are that the physical and mental and functional well-being of older adults and how we support that, how we support older adults that actually I think sometimes we sort of think, well, we wrap them in cotton wool. We expect them just to sort of sit and be safe. And actually sitting them and making them safe means that their function declines, and it can decline quite rapidly. And so I've been involved in some work that's been funded and supported by Helping Hand that's looking at evaluating their exercise program to look at the benefits of that. And that had quite a profound effect on me because I was working with people again from working with, it's almost like actually seeing the impact both on the carers that were looking after the older adults, as well as the impact on the older adult themselves, with a very short, not that intense exercise program that impacted on their function. And I was, if it's okay with you, would share a screen that that shows and demonstrates the impact most profoundly, I think.
Yes, please.
I hope this might work. So,
brilliant.
So what you see on this screen, the orange bars are people in a control period. So over 12 weeks, this is their change in performance on hand grip. And so how strong are they? And you can see here that this is percentage change. That went down by a significant amount over this 12-week period. Timed up and go, that's how quickly they can get up out of the seat and walk. This was longer, so they declined again. And then the 5 repetition sit to stand. This is a functional measure of their ability to stand up. And this again decreased compared to the people that are the blue bars. And those are the individuals that had 12 weeks of exercise intervention, but only 1 session a week that was 20 minutes to 40 minutes in length with an exercise physiologist. Wow. And you can see that they've maintained their function. So it's not a lot of activity, but it was enough for them not to decline over that 12-week period.
Wow. So in that session, that weekly session, what kind of exercise were they doing?
It was all very tailored to the individual, and at least half of these individuals had dementia, so they were in secure memory units within Helping Hand. So it would be tailored to what they were able to do, and so it would be functionally challenging them, and it might have balance in it. It may have some aerobic, just cycling. So. And we used arm ergometers and feet ergometers, or the exercise physiologists used arm and feet ergometers, so pedals. So individuals that were otherwise immobile would be able to use their arms, and it improved their grip strength. And that's why it challenged the perceptions of the care staff, because they didn't realise that the individuals would be able to do some of these exercises. And I think one of the other things that was a really great initiative by the exercise physiologist was that the sessions were conducted wherever the individual felt happy. And some of those were in the lounge room. And other guests or other members of the unit, other residents, actually started copying and repeating the exercises when they saw the exercise physiologist come in. And the care staff was saying, well, I didn't realise that our residents were able to create new memories and create new actions with people. There was one lady that had a stroke, and her left side was paralysed, but she used her right hand to start to repeat some of the exercises. And that's what I mean, really profound effects that changed the perceptions of the care staff of what the residents were capable of doing. And so there's this ripple effect that was really quite palpable, and people feeling happier about the engagement. And it wasn't just a declining trajectory that occurred.
Yeah, I love that. It changes all of our perceptions really about what it means to be active, especially at an older age. Because when you were saying about exercise interventions with older people, I automatically think of those really extremely fit elderly people who are still exercising so much. I'm like, that's a very high standard. But as you say, it's just this small intervention once a week, and it's had such a profound effect.
Oh, absolutely. And we had, so in our evaluation, we had both we were analysing both functional measures, but also qualitatively. We've got one care staff lady who's describing a resident, and she says, and this lady, she's a 2-person assist, and she's meant to be a 2-person assist. But I walked into the lounge room, and she's standing, and she's walking, and she's not meant to be able to do. And you could see in how she was phrasing what she was saying is that, well, I didn't think she could do that, but she can. And therefore we need to, and that's why I said we need to support and enable our older adults to be able to maintain their mobility, and not necessarily think, oh, you can't do that, you've got to sit down and be safe. So it's a challenge. That will be down the road in my challenge.
And you mentioned that that some people were kind of convinced by doing it by seeing others do it. But did you find that once an individual started engaging in the sessions each week, they stayed engaged? They didn't kind of want to withdraw, or they didn't decide they had enough, they wanted to stay on board?
Oh, absolutely. And Helping Hand have put in place some sustainability programs. So there are a number of initiatives that came out of that the exercise physiologists, because obviously their time, they were moving from unit to unit and they wanted things to continue. And so lifestyle staff have been involved in now supporting the program, but also putting together what would best be described as a almost like a little training program that can go up in the units that describe and have markers of where people should go and how they do the exercises. And so residents would come out of their rooms and would join in and follow the instructions and would bring other people with them. So it had that social impact as well. And certainly the sort of comments were very much around that people were engaging and they want to engage and are continuing. And I think that's has been one of the risks of COVID, in that lifestyle staff haven't been able to go in. That will have had a profound effect. And at the moment we're waiting to see if we get funding to actually have a look to see what sort of effect that might have had. Because I think we're going to have to explore ways of helping to maintain mobility, but with a socially distancing, that's really tricky.
Yeah,
and you're right. That decline is quite steep over a 12-week period, and we've had more than that now with COVID.
And you're so right. Often that social aspect can be a really strong incentive.
Absolutely, yeah.
You've led us somewhat into the realm of complications and challenges, which leads nicely to my next question, which is, what have been the most challenging elements of the work that you've been doing?
There are a number. Funding is always a challenge, but we're not focused on that. I think often it is recruitment, because within exercise psychology, you tend to get the worried well, or those people that are prepared to change, coming forward and being part of your projects and being part of your research. And really what we need to do is understand what is it that's stopping those people from putting their hands up, that are the people that actually we need to get at. And I guess that's one of the other areas that I'm interested in is the messaging around exercise and exercise intensities that you mentioned in my bio. So I've spent probably the last 2 decades looking at how exercise makes us feel. And it's a bit of a paradox, because everybody says exercise makes you feel good, but people don't exercise. And one of the problems there is that when exercise stimuli stops, so when that huffing and puffing stops, we get this rebound in how we feel. So we feel good afterwards because that horrible feeling has just stopped. And so that started leading to examining how do people feel during exercise. And actually, there's now research that demonstrates it's how you feel during that predicts what you'll do in 6 months and 12 months. So if your prescription, and if you are telling and prescribing exercise that has a negative feeling, that feels painful, or it hurts, or it feels embarrassing for young girls, is often they sweat, they feel, and they don't like that feeling. So that makes them feel bad about exercise. So they don't choose to do it. And so one of the area of research we're doing is looking at how do we regulate exercise intensity so that the individual's in control, and what does that mean in terms of how hard they're working and how they're feeling. And again, some of that research that we've done has shown that if you allow someone to self-select their exercise intensity, so it feels okay, it doesn't feel great, it feels okay, then they'll select an intensity that is exactly where you would prescribe it. But if I then prescribed exactly that same intensity, how they feel about it becomes more negative. And if you take that logic that if it feels more negative, then in future I'm not going to do it, then you've had this negative impact from the way you've introduced it. And one of the things that's happening a lot in schools is that is one of the necessary elements of us understanding the health and fitness of our populations and our children, is using the shuttle run, or the bleep test you may have heard.
Oh, I used to hate that.
I've got some memories of this.
Well, bleep, it's a maximum test. Everybody feels bad at the end of that test.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's so validating to hear you say that.
Absolutely. No, everybody does. And so what we've been doing, and I've got a master's student that's about to submit, he's exploring the use of a submaximal test. And we've been doing some research in the background around using perceived exertion and how hard you perceive you're working. And we've shown that using perceived exertion, you can actually predict maximal work capacity and your aerobic capacity. And what we've demonstrated in this study is that with girls, there's no difference in boys, but with girls, if we use a submax test, they feel significantly more positive midway through, but it predicts max VO2 better than if we use a max test. So I'd be turning around and saying, well, why are we using a max test?
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah.
I find that so interesting. It makes me think back to early high school and exactly what you were saying, being a young girl, your body's changing, you feel really awkward.
Yes.
And then I hated PE classes.
Absolutely.
But then I would go off to do a dance class that went for 3 hours, was really hard work, but I'd chosen it.
Absolutely. So that's, and we talk about that in terms of motivationally, it's self-determination. If I control what I do it within my own competence levels, and therefore I feel good. My affect, my feeling is that felt pleasant. I was working hard, but I was calling the tune on it. And so my message would be, we need to look more at allowing people to have that self-regulation. Because it enables them to engage. And we've done some work with that with people that are cancer survivors, because we know that cancer treatment impacts on how you feel. So instead of prescribing the same intensity, changing what we're prescribing based on how they're feeling, so that they still engage in doing some of that physical activity, which we know is good for their well-being.
Yeah, that's super interesting for me, because it kind of turns my expectations of exercise on its head, because I've always kind of assumed that I would perform better if I had someone telling me what to do, or a personal trainer kind of shouting like, go one more. And it might be more grueling, but I assumed that I would benefit from it. But in fact, I might feel better if I didn't.
Well, you might benefit from it physiologically in the short term. But again, as an exercise psychologist, I'd be saying, well, I want you in there for the long haul. I don't want you to just do the exercise whilst it's being prescribed. And again, research that we've done in cardiac rehabilitation environments, where the perception was, well, I take my tablet, I go to the cardiac rehab for 8 weeks, they sign me off and I'm better. And I stop exercising because I've taken the prescription that you've told me to take. Whereas what we want is maybe, we recognize that you've got to get that cardiovascular impact, but if we do it in a way that's controlled and that engages with the person being in control, then when you stop those classes, the person will continue to do their activity. So it creates that habit formation that I'm doing this because I choose to, and you've given me the competencies and the skills to do it on my own as well.
So along those lines, what do you think are the key things that need to change for that to become the way we think and talk about exercise?
Well, I think it's slowly getting there. So I think we know now that one of the things that's being prescribed or being discussed by governing bodies and things like the American College of Sports Medicine, that used to focus on exercise prescription being the right intensity and safe, they're now adding in that it should be pleasant and should be
Yay!
So it is about that enjoyment. So there's they're starting to recognize that the psychology might have something here that's important. So I think it's getting that message across, but it's in medical models, they like to know what the dose is. They want to know how much. And actually the evidence now is saying, well, actually just accumulating, breaking up sedentary behavior, doing more mobile activity is really important. And actually less stress on the actual intensity, but accumulating activity. And for sure, look, for different conditions, their higher intensity may be important. But for example, with older adults, that we're now saying you just break up sedentary time, move as much as you're able to move at whatever pace you're able to move at, and do some balance exercises. So balance is becoming much more important, and maintaining functional strength, Because if you sit down for, and some of our participants would be sitting down for 80-90% of the day and then not doing much else, then their functional status is, their muscle mass and their muscle strength is going to go, which will mean that they can't get up and walk, even if they chose to.
It's interesting to think a bit about, you mentioned COVID earlier, and it's completely hard to avoid because it's everywhere. But I am wondering how much that'll impact people's habits, because I've noticed even in myself, I have a fairly active daily life normally because of my style of work. And now that we're working from home, I'm doing so much more sitting, so much more screen time.
Yes, absolutely.
So do you think that'll put a bit of a spanner in the works for people's routines, and we'll have to make a more concerted effort to find other ways to exercise?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it will have to be much more intentional. That so for example, I use a stand-up desk, so when I'm at work I am standing up, but I noticed that from home zooming, I would normally be running between buildings at City East to go to meetings, but I'm just clicking a button, so my step count went way down.
Yeah, it's all that incidental exercise.
Absolutely. So the incidental's really, really important, and having to build that in. But I think we've seen people's mental health struggling with that whole coping with COVID, and we know that physical activity does have a relationship with mental health. So we know that exercise is good for us, or physical activity is good for avoiding mental health and building resilience.
It's interesting that you bring that up, Ashton, because I feel like I have gone through that process of, before I was very much an incidental exerciser. I would walk to work mostly. I would be on my feet a lot at work. And at first, when I was working from home, I was a bit confronted because I was like, well, I don't usually go out to seek a lot of exercise, but I went and downloaded a yoga app so that I could try and seek out these things. And look, my record's not great, but I have tried to instigate that change in myself. And I think a lot of people I know have been doing that as well. So it is, I hope, sort of in motion and continuing to stay in motion.
Well, it is, but you're somebody that recognised the need, and I think for me the concern is that there's a large proportion of the population that don't recognise that they need to be more active, or that the benefits if they were more active are pretty great. So that's a challenge. The challenge of how do we make sure that we get that message across? Because I think, and how we get funding for it, because we're not very good at funding prevention.
Yes,
we tend to fund treatment. And everybody says, but we know exercise is good for you, so we're not going to fund that. And it's actually about, well, it's how do we introduce, what strategies do we use? And there's some really great work that colleagues are doing here that are using apps and looking at ways in which we engage and use technology to help support people being more physically active and more aware that they need to have lifestyle choices and behaviours that will help them to maintain their well-being.
It's tricky, that shift in approach with funding bodies. I've had this exact conversation with my sister who works in preventative health, and has said how hard it is to get funding, because funding boards like to be able to say, look how many people we fixed, rather than look how many people never got sick.
Yes. But when you look at the actual cost of care, it's maybe not that, it's work. And that's one of the other areas we're really, I've got a colleague that's leading some research that's looking at carers and the carers' health, because we know that if the carers become unhealthy, then they're not going to be able to care for the person that they are the caring for, and it becomes a bit, we've got some research and we've got some evidence from a project that was funded by the Road Home that shows that carers of veterans have to stay healthy, but that's a struggle for them, and that their sleep is directly related to their levels of distress, and their moderate to vigorous physical activity is directly related to their levels of resilience. So we know it's important. It's just we've got to now invest in providing support and programs that will help them to be able to engage in the right sort of amount of activity, which can be challenging if they're caring for somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something we could talk about for a very long time, and I wish we could, but sadly we're going to have to finish up in just a minute. But before you go, we'd love to know what your research will look like in the next little while.
Okay, so some of the work, we're progressing that work. So what I want, the master's student is going to apply to do a PhD, and we're looking at actually how we can roll that sub-max shuttle run into a school environment. Because if we can, yes, so I've got you on board, Ashton.
Yes, I hated that.
But for that younger population, if we can give appropriate data that is reliable, but we can avoid that negative feeling, then that might help some people to stay active and have a more positive perception of it. And I think for me, we're also looking at how we support older adults. How do we ensure that we have programs that enable at least a minimum amount of activity to be supported and available to them.
That all sounds like such important work. Before we wrap up, if this has piqued interest for people watching, where do you suggest they go to find out more or to keep in touch with your work?
Well, my website, or if you go to my homepage, there are links to some of my research, and we've got links to some of the work that we've done in the aged care sector. And there's a glossy, and we've got some online resources that we'd be able to make available to people for that. And the ARENA website, the research concentration that I'm part of, has some really good information on the projects that are running.
Fantastic. One of our wonderful moderators will be peppering those links into the chat. So if you like to check those out, just click on them. But thank you so much, Gaynor, for joining us today. We've really appreciated the time you've taken to join us on Mon TV.
You're welcome. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Bye.